Greetings, everyone. I would like to extend a warm welcome to everybody listening and watching tonight, and those also interested in our 3-day conference. My name is Tuncay Kardaş. I'm Professor of International Politics and Director of Middle East Institute of Sakarya University. It's my pleasure to host tonight's event. We will first listen to our rector's brief remarks, and then I will have a short address. I will briefly introduce and explain our institute's work, and then we will move on to Dr. Pianki's presentation. Hocam, söz sizde.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to our 5th Congress. I wish everyone a great weekend.
Thank you very much to our rector, Professor Savaşan. I would like to start in my brief address Turkish, Arabic, and English, and they are given by experienced lecturers and researchers who are experts in the field. To start, well, I guess it was Winston Churchill who, some time ago, some 80 years ago, in a radio broadcast, defined Russia in a famous quip as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. He was obviously trying to point to the difficulty of making sense of the great political transformation Russia had gone through at the time. From Churchill to Macron, the Middle East has always been a dangerous foreign land for certain people, for certain policymakers. Recently, Le Monde criminalized even a theory, a post-colonial theory, while Macron pointed fingers at a specific religious orientation, Islam. For us at the Institute, the Middle East is not a puzzle to be solved nor fixed, because we believe puzzles call for dominant images and hegemonic blueprints. They are counterproductive and vindictive and they are simply dismissing an area field study as enigmatic or quixotic and somehow dangerous. We believe that the Middle East indeed presents a complex picture, and we will try to explain and present this picture throughout 3 days Congress of Sakarya University, as you know. Yes, Middle East indeed presents a difficult picture, but certainly much more complex than a puzzle. Churchill offered national interest as a key to solve this puzzle of Russia. We don't have that key in the Middle East either. It's not easy to simply find out a key to solve or fix a whole field of study. How do we study the region then? There are roughly 2 dominant visions in the study of the Middle East. One focuses on the policy relevant issues about the Middle East, in the Middle East, and it takes the Cold War form of knowledge. It's very often, it's prevalent, it's still with us. This vision indeed contributed a lot to the subordination of scholarship to state interests, particularly the US national interests, and it revolved around the idea of national security state. The other vision, second vision, rightly highlights the role of big money in shaping this field of study. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford Foundation, in the emergence of the field, or the role of more contemporary lobbies in the consolidation of this field. The main outcome, though, of these 2 visions is that it mixed the world of power with world of learning, which is a dangerous mix. We believe that there is no quick fix to these problems that we face increasingly. We cannot, as an institute, obviously, we are part of this field of study, and we want to contribute in our capacity to the betterment of knowledge. But we cannot command the global mechanics or logistics to shape the field study. We are not an externally funded institution, and while this is a serious shortcoming, I have to say that somehow it also gives us an opportunity to remain independent. But we do believe that out of this gridlock, out of this paradox, if you like, there is a more scientific and methodological approach to the study of the Middle East, and we are striving for this. Together, my colleagues at the Institute, our purpose is not try to solve the Middle East, the so-called Middle East puzzle, but we want to make it more comprehensible for the professionals, students, and lay people. For this aim, we have decided to uphold an interdisciplinary and scientific approach, and we employ more rigorous methodological approaches to the subject matter, ranging from Syrian civil war to the migration. We would like to benefit from this multidisciplinary, or more correctly, interdisciplinary approach by utilizing IR theory, history, economic and social theory, and this is part of our curriculum and part of our strategy to maintain a successful training at our graduate programs. we do believe that the number of actors, influential actors, who can make a voice in the Middle East should be bigger than, should be more than simply states. Non-state actors, armed or otherwise, should be included in the bigger picture. By providing multidimensional analyses, our aim is to connect the dots between local, regional, and global politics and levels of analysis. It's not an easy task. We are aware of it. And we're at the embryonic stages of our efforts. But we do believe that out of these two visions, there is no easy way to explain and understand events unfolding in the Middle Eastern context. So we would encourage our students and our followers and staff to pay more attention to not only domestic and international levels to explain an event, for example, and also factors, but we would like them to try to connect these levels in a theoretically meaningful way. One of the key pillars here is that we keep our training programs up to date, and we also engage in activities that share research findings through various events like this very Congress. I'm happy to say that in the last year, our institute has become one of the top 3 in terms of Web of Science publications, in terms of event activities and other activities. Our institute is an ideal platform for students who want to work across different disciplines. We hold local social events as well as workshops, lectures, and conferences. Together with our university partners from Spain and Hungary, we hope that our work will inform and educate not just professionals or students, but also the general public, media, and governments as well. Before I move on to Dr. Bianchi, I'd like to also very briefly introduce him to our viewers. I'm sure many of you already know him, his great work and his scholarship. But let me briefly introduce him to you. Professor Bianchi is a political scientist and an international lawyer with special interests in China and the Muslim world. He received his PhD and law degrees at the University of Chicago. He has taught at the University of Chicago, Nanjing University, Qatar University, the American University in Cairo, and the University of Pennsylvania. He is currently writing a book about China's deepening connections with Islamic countries and their role in altering the balance of power in Afro-Eurasia and beyond. His previous books include Islamic Globalization, Pilgrimage, Capitalism, Democracy, and Diplomacy, Guests of God, Pilgrimage and Politics in the Islamic World, Unruly Corporatism, Associational Life in 20th Century, Interest Groups and Political Development in Turkey, all published by very prestigious publication outlets. Before we move on to his presentation, I'd like you to watch a video which is about 1 or 2 minutes, and then we will hopefully have Dr. Bianchi's presentation. Welcome back. We will now have, hopefully, the presentation by Professor Bianchi. And I'd like to also inform you that we will have around 1 hour presentation, and 40 minutes or so we will have the presentation itself, and the last 15 to 20 minutes we will have a Q&A session. Professor Bianchi, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yes. Thank you very much for again accepting our invitation.
My pleasure.
So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for your invitation, and especially thank you for sending me the fascinating summary of the papers in your forthcoming deliberations. I had a chance to look them over, and I have to tell you, I'm very impressed by the creativity and the energy in reworking some basic concepts in political science and international relations. These are fields that have needed some new blood and new thinking for a while, and I can see that Turkish scholars are making a great effort to give us exactly that. There's a vitality, independence, originality in your work that comes through immediately. So I can see that your intellectual life is blooming in a way that many of us in the United States can benefit from and would love to participate in. And I hope I can encourage that in a small way myself. I'm very pleased to see the many perspectives in these papers. Not only the typical think tank focus on individual countries and policy problems, but wider regional interpretations and some effort at trans-regional comparison between the Middle East and other areas, and also at some global overview. And this is really missing in a lot of the mainstream work that we see not only in Middle Eastern studies, but in international relations generally. So in that spirit, let me try to give my own interpretation of Middle Eastern trends, emphasizing a larger context beyond just the nation or the Middle East as a self-contained region. And I will try to stress trans-regional and global dimensions, especially with regard to China. And I think, by the way, that your choice of China as the opening point of reference in your discussion says a great deal about your sensitivity to the kinds of changes that are occurring. And this is very encouraging. So, by the way, the book that Dr. Kardash mentioned is out. It came out last year from Oxford. It's called China and the Islamic World, How the New Silk Road is Transforming Global Politics. So that's available. Let me begin by simply reading an abstract of the presentation that I prepared. And it will, I think, summarize very neatly the major points I want to make, and then I'll move on to deal with them in greater detail and give some examples of the general points that I'm making. The title of the talk is China and the Middle East. The subtitle, Collecting Bargaining Chips for Higher Order Conflicts. So I think that pretty much summarizes my view of how China interacts with the Middle East in general. China's approach to the Middle East is guided by patient opportunism, a cautious and pragmatic diplomacy that views the region as a mixed bag of relatively low priority interests that rank below its wide-ranging global conflicts with the United States and its simmering disputes with multiple neighbors in the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. In dealing with Middle Eastern issues, China does not behave as a unitary actor with a fixed will. Chinese nationalism is as diverse as Chinese society, and there are constant debates over all aspects of Middle Eastern relations at multiple levels. Many voices compete in defining national interests and translating them into concrete policies, including leaders in the party, the military, the police, the diplomatic corps, the state enterprises, local governments, universities, think tanks, journalists, and a growing array of citizens groups. Foreign observers often exaggerate China's eagerness to replace the United States as the dominant power in the region and indeed in the world. According to these accounts, Chinese leaders are beginning to fill imagined power vacuums as American influence ebbs in Middle Eastern lands that supposedly hold the key to geopolitical control of Eurasia, Africa, and the global South. In fact, many Chinese officials and commentators are warning against over-involvement in Middle Eastern minefields and quagmires, reminding the public and the government that the region has a well-earned reputation as the graveyard of empires. Even when Chinese policymakers deliberately pursue greater influence across the Middle East, they worry that short-term gains in one country might jeopardize more important interests in the region as a whole and beyond, particularly in managing global tensions with a more hostile America. In this context, China's Middle East strategy is not to secure bases or footholds to control the region itself, but to collect bargaining chips that can be useful in advancing greater interests closer to home and elsewhere around the world. Let me try to fill in some details of these general points. The major starting point, I think, is understanding the dramatic deterioration in relations between the United States and China in the last several years. The escalation of tensions between the two countries has spread to a number of areas, and it's very unlikely to be reversed. Even now, they're having great difficulty making connections between the new Biden administration and the Xi Jinping regime. The Chinese are trying to open back channel communications, and they're waiting for other countries to take the lead, and obviously don't want to appear overly friendly or eager to embrace the new Biden administration. In this regard, the Middle East has to be seen as something that is of lower priority than other regional conflicts that might engage Chinese and American forces, especially closer to home in the Pacific area, especially Hong Kong, Taiwan, the South China Sea. So China's focus is very much on its immediate borders, in the Pacific and also in South Asia with India. And it's in this regard that Chinese and American interests in the Middle East might overlap, but that the Chinese are very eager to avoid any kind of overt confrontation with the United States in the Middle East. They don't want to overextend themselves in an area where they think the Americans already have an advantage. Rather than remove the United States influence, they would like to see the United States continue to be bogged down in Middle Eastern problems, because this diverts American forces and attention from the Pacific and the Indian Ocean and Central Asia, areas where China feels a much more important security interest, and where it wants to concentrate its military forces and its political efforts. So the Middle East is viewed very much as an area where China is able to deflect American efforts to move toward the Pacific, and to keep the United States split in its attention between a Pacific theater and a Middle Eastern theater. In this context, there is a suspicion in China that Middle Eastern governments and political movements are eager to manipulate both the United States and China, especially countries that have traditionally been in the American orbit. And there is a suspicion that if China becomes too conciliatory or too close to Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Egypt, that in the long run they'll wind up going back to the United States, and they'll use warming relations with China as a bargaining chip to exert greater leverage on American and European partners. So the overview, the big picture, is that Middle Eastern interests are of relatively low priority for China. I would say that their top priority is avoiding a military conflict with the United States, but also being able to compete as effectively as possible for economic and diplomatic advantage with the Americans. Secondly, China's relations with the European Union and with Russia are very important. The third rank is this whole set of neighboring regions bordering China, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia, where there are ongoing border disputes and territorial conflicts, where China is trying to increase its sphere of influence, and the competition for spheres of influence with the United States is going to increase more and more. This means that the fourth level, the sort of lowest tier, is a collection of other regions, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. I would argue that Middle Eastern interests in China's view are about on a par with those in Africa, but above Latin America. Latin America is still viewed as an American preserve, where Chinese intrusion is particularly unwelcome and controversial. Africa, on the other hand, is seen as a more open and receptive set of opportunities. But the Middle East is viewed with suspicion and great caution and great concern for the possible costs and unintended consequences and risks that would be involved. The particular conflicts with the United States are really quite wide-ranging. They include not just a trade war, but also the effort of successive American governments to build a kind of anti-Chinese alliance in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, to link Pacific and Indian Ocean issues in what is called a free and open Indo-Pacific sphere. So the US is trying to pull Japan, Australia, India into a larger coalition that would counter Chinese advances in the South China Sea, and then also through the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road going through Asia and the Middle East to Europe. In other words, I think the United States is beginning to understand that China has a global strategy, a kind of grand strategy, and that the United States has been behind in perceiving it, in understanding its consequences, and in attempting to respond to it. One of the great examples of that is the current turbulence in Thailand, where China believes that the United States is belatedly responding to Thailand's rapprochement with Beijing. Warming relations between Thailand and China are seen as an inroad to traditional American spheres of influence, and the anti-monarchy movement and pro-democracy movement in Thailand is seen in Beijing as very much American instigated, and there has been the interesting development of something called the Milk Tea Alliance, in which Thailand pro-democracy movements have reached out to other movements which are hostile to China in the region, especially in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. And then gradually they've spilled over into other countries like South Korea, Australia, even Belarus is now inventing its own kind of milk tea to associate with these other countries. The idea is that the Chinese drink tea without milk, but their neighbors add milk in one way or another. And this non-Chinese manner of drinking tea is seen as a kind of cultural defiance against Chinese inroads into the nationalist cultures and national interests of a number of countries in the Pacific. And the idea that this is a snowballing phenomenon, a kind of color revolution, as the Chinese call it, spurred by social media campaigns and by pro-American and American-funded civil society groups. All of this is interpreted in China as part of an orchestrated American effort to resist China's growing political and economic influence in Eurasia, Afro-Eurasia in general. The other areas in which China has important conflicts, of course, are with Vietnam and Japan and South Korea and India. So you can see that there's a really range of interconnected issues that are smoldering and which are bound to get worse over the long term, and which are open to exploitation by China's adversaries, especially the United States. These are going to preoccupy Chinese interests for many years to come, and it's in that context that the Middle East should be seen as a relatively risky and marginal area where the Chinese are extremely reluctant to become overcommitted and to repeat what they regard as the key errors of American policy in overestimating their ability to influence countries and cultures that they do not understand. With regard to this caution of Chinese thinking toward the Middle East in general, there is nonetheless a great deal of flexibility. As I said, there are many voices constantly debating the risks and benefits, the costs and the possible gains of improving relations with each country and in various areas, the economy and military relations and diplomatic and cultural relations. There are lots of possibilities for change and very dramatic shifts over time in China's approach to particular countries. And one example is Syria, in which the early approach to this revolution and the Assad regime's problems was non-intervention, that there should be a hands-off approach to Syria, and China would not become involved. This changed, of course, when problems in Syria and Iraq began to reverberate in China itself, especially with Uyghur fighters who were returning to Xinjiang. And then it appeared that Syria was not simply a far-off problem of no concern, but that it was a direct threat to domestic security. And then finally, as the war is beginning to shift after Russian intervention toward a pro-Damascus conclusion, the Chinese are thinking of post-war construction. So now they've left non-intervention behind completely and are thinking of becoming a partner of the Assad regime and getting the lion's share of the profits in rebuilding Aleppo and other cities that that the Syrian and Russian air forces have demolished. There is a paper in the collection that you sent me that deals with China as relations by Selim Terbulbul from Ankara University, who makes exactly this analysis. And I think Mr. Terbulbul has hit the mark fully. And I congratulate him for this analysis. I think it's right on the mark. Foreigners tend to exaggerate the Chinese desire to rush in to fill supposed power vacuums where the United States is beginning to downgrade its commitments. And I think that this is a misreading, that the Chinese are very happy to see the Americans squirm in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in dealing with Iran. And there's really no feeling. There's no feeling that there's any great need to let the Americans off the hook by sharing diplomatic efforts to solve problems that are more serious for Washington than for Beijing, or that Beijing should somehow take the place of Americans in guaranteeing security, for example, in the Persian Gulf. The idea that the Chinese military can benefit from Americans being tied down, at least, and being forced to split their strategic resources between Middle Eastern and Pacific theaters is very important in China. In other words, this business of the Obama pivot to Asia being slowed down by continuing flare-ups in the Middle East is very much to the advantage of the Chinese. What this means is that in looking at the Middle East, there is a tendency to see it as part of a much larger set of confrontations and struggles for advantage around the world, beginning with direct American and Chinese conflicts, especially in the economy, in cyberspace, and in territorial disputes in the Pacific, but then also in terms of third parties, third countries, where China and the United States are trying to exert leverage in a kind of tug of war. And that, of course, is most of the countries of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. So from that point of view, all of these issues are in play, though on the table at the same time. So many disagreements are being discussed that there's no possibility that they're all going to be resolved. The best that one can hope for is that there will be some kind of trade-off, some kind of tit for tat, in which one region or one issue will see a kind of modus vivendi, a kind of compromise. And there will be a give and take. And from that point of view, the Middle East is filled with opportunities for bargaining. And no single country is viewed as indispensable or as a reliable or natural partner. for China. And there are no firm alliances. Mainly what a number of Chinese scholars refer to as quasi-alliances. That is to say, basically temporary and partial arrangements of convenience, which can be renegotiated depending upon shifting circumstances. And with regard to particular countries in the Middle East, if I had to describe Chinese priorities, I would say in a rough order: Pakistan over Iran, over Turkey, over Egypt. Pakistan is viewed as the closest thing to a real ally for China, probably because of its irresolvable and escalating conflicts with India, so that they have a common enemy, and also because Pakistan has been alienated from the United States more and more as a result of events in Afghanistan. And also because Pakistan shares a border with China, it is seen as having a much more direct relevance to the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. So for all of those reasons, the New Silk Road, the Belt and Road, began in Pakistan, focused a lot of its early investment there, and has become a kind of area for skirmishing with India and the United States. The more the Chinese invest in Pakistan, the more they build infrastructure, the more they encounter resistance from local groups like the Baluchis, who are alienated and who find occasional support from Indian Secret Service groups that are eager to sabotage increasing Pakistani and Chinese relations. After Pakistan, Iran is really a key partner for China because of its connections both north and south and east and west in transportation and transshipment, the building of railroads and of ports, and energy infrastructure is very key in Iran. Pakistan and Iran sit side by side, and they're kind of like cloverleaf interchanges in big highway construction, going, as I said, both north and south, connecting land and sea routes, and then east and west, connecting Pacific and Mediterranean markets. The problem with Iran, of course, is its nuclear ambition, which the Chinese very much want to control without seeming to follow American dictates. But nonetheless, the Chinese do not want to become involved in a military confrontation with Israel or the United States. And there have been several times when Chinese diplomats and scholars have publicly scolded the Iranians and told them that if they go too far in their nuclear ambitions, they'll be on their own and they will not be able to count on kind of Chinese military or diplomatic support. Turkey, I think, is a real challenge for the Chinese. They realize how important Turkey is, what a great prize it would be to pull it away further from NATO, from the European Union, and now this flare-up with Macron is just, like a big Thanksgiving turkey for the Chinese. They couldn't dream up a better scenario. And the conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean has all kinds of potential similarities to the Chinese claims in the South China Sea, where both Turkey and China now appear to be challenging conventional principles of the law of the sea, and the possibilities there for trade-offs and piggybacking are quite high. But all of that has to take into consideration the ongoing problems in Xinjiang and the completely irresolvable conflict between Turkey and China over the religious and the racial conflict there, and also conflicting ambitions in Central Asia. Although I think Turkey has sort of scaled back its involvement in Central Asia since the times of Süleyman Demirel or Turgut Özal, and the Chinese are comfortable with the arrangement that they have with Turkey in most Central Asian countries. But there's no underestimating the problems of Xinjiang, and they reverberate within China very, very widely. There is a great fear of security dangers spilling over from Xinjiang. The Hong Kong demonstrations and the heavy hand shown there, I think, is a kind of pairing, a kind of bookend with the internment camps and labor camps, re-education programs in Xinjiang. So the idea that Hong Kong and the Chinese heartland on the mainland, the East Coast, and Xinjiang and Central Asia, that they are connected in some way, is very much on the mind of Chinese security officials. And there is a deep fear of the possibility of domestic disturbance being encouraged by events elsewhere, such as the Arab Springs, plural, because of the more recent upsurge in popular protest in Algeria and Sudan, and elsewhere. So the Arab Spring isn't over, and the Arab Spring of 2011 set off great waves of security and fear among the Chinese security services. That's not over by a long shot. After Turkey, I would say far after Turkey, comes Egypt, where I think there is very little appetite for either economic or political investment. Egyptian desire for greater partnership with China is far greater than the Chinese willingness to reciprocate. The Chinese see Egypt as kind of a burning building, and they don't want to become tenants or residents of that burning building just when it's about to have the roof fall in. So I think that if you examine the Middle East, there's a wide range of different calculations that the Chinese make from country to country and from time to time. And that there are possible trade-offs and benefits in many areas, especially the law of the sea, with the new issues in the Eastern Mediterranean, and always in human rights, with countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia having very black reputations in the international community. There is the sense that China can offer them some diplomatic cover against attack from UN and European human rights advocates. What is striking to me about the Chinese view of Middle Eastern nations is their constant attention to how advances in a particular country and a particular policy might influence the region as a whole. So that becoming involved with Iran is seen as potentially disturbing relations with the Gulf Arab countries and Israel, and also with the United States. So Iran is never viewed in isolation. It's always viewed in terms of what other trade-offs there might be with other potential partners and other potential gains in the Middle East itself, as well as with the United States and its European allies more generally in the global level. What this all comes down to in the end, I think, is that China and the United States face some very unpleasant choices that are going to become clearer in time, and that supersede events in the Middle East. And those are unpleasant choices about what is worth fighting for. Do they want to fight for dominance, coexistence? Do they want to fight for territory? Do they want to fight for resources? Is it more important to defend the homeland or to extend spheres of influence? And when it comes to spheres of influence, what's the difference between Pacific areas bordering China immediately and further areas like the Middle East or Africa, and even Latin America? Has great ambitions in Latin America and is very rapidly increasing its influence there. But compared to the Middle East, Latin America is even more volatile in terms of possible provocations to American interests. So as cautiously as the Chinese pursue interests in the Middle East, they double that caution when it comes to Latin America. The other major choice is, if there is conflict, military conflict, what is the better type of war? A direct conflict or a proxy war, something that is short and local, or something that is drawn out and covers a wider territory in a longer time. I think it's pretty clear that the Chinese are preparing for what they hope will be a local and brief confrontation on their borders. And the Americans understand that such a confrontation now would probably be much more to the advantage of the Chinese than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago. And for that reason, the Americans are preparing much broader war strategies that would attempt to draw the Chinese out further into the ocean, into the Pacific, and to overextend their supplies and perhaps pose some kind of a naval blockade. So there you have it, a short war near home or a longer war that would exhaust Chinese resources and patience and play to the advantage of the Americans' conventional strength. All of this, of course, is dependent upon the very arrogant thinking of military strategists that they can control a conflict once it begins. And we know that that is a fantasy. But that is the reality, I think, that we face as we see China and the United States engaging more and more in this dance of aggression and posturing and struggling to gain respect from one another and from their local populations and from the international community. So what I'm suggesting is really that any Middle Eastern scholar who understands the importance of looking beyond national borders would then also understand the importance of looking beyond regional stereotypes, and at least thinking in terms of trans-regional comparison, and that only makes sense in terms of a major global perspective, and that today and in the years ahead, the most important aspect of the global context is going to be this increasing hostility between American and Chinese forces, which are instantly frustrated with one another, and with that have not yet come to terms with the realization that neither country can run the world independently or build an alliance that will allow them to achieve dominance. And until we get beyond that that kind of butting of heads, everything that happens in the Middle East and every other region, I think, will have to be understood as being influenced by that, and in turn as potentially influencing that outcome. So I hope that is helpful, and if you have questions or want to begin a discussion, I'm happy to hear your remarks.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. It was really an important tour d'horizon. I'm very happy to have your views on this very important topic because you're an expert. I'd like to ask a couple of questions that are pouring in really through our YouTube channel. First off, how do you see China's Persian policy? Is there a Persian policy, or is there a specific country policy which China pays more attention than other regional states? For example, is there something which is more important to China than other countries? Is Iran or Turkey more important?
Yes, well, as I said, I think there is a general sense that Pakistan comes before Iran, and that both of those come before Turkey, and that all of those come before everything else, including Egypt. Iran is really a fascinating case, and the chapter of my book on China-Iranian relations is called Iran the Great Divider. And I say that Iran is the Great Divider because in China, there is no Middle Eastern question that causes more controversy and disagreement and passionate exchange than discussions about Iran. And when I talk to Chinese colleagues, and when I listen to their debates with one another, the range of opinions on Iran is much wider than the range of opinions on any other country. There is a kind of stable factionalism in the Chinese diplomatic and military and academic community, among those who see Iran as a business opportunity, or those who see Iran as a political and strategic opportunity, and those who see Iran as a pain in the neck and as a potential trap for naive Chinese opportunists. When I talk about China's diplomacy and approach to the Middle East as a kind of patient opportunism, Iran comes to mind very quickly because the patience and the opportunism are in great conflict and competition with one another. The ambassadors from China to Iran have run the gambit from economic interests in the early days, sort of opening up relations in an era when Iran was becoming more isolated and more targeted by American and European adversaries. The idea there was simply to let nature take its course and allow Iran to find support when it needed it from China in terms of investment and diplomatic backing. Later, there were a number of ambassadors from China who had experience in the Arab world, especially in Syria and in Lebanon. And for them, Iran was a way of increasing challenges to American dominance in the Arab world, especially in the Gulf and in the Fertile Crescent, and all the way to the Mediterranean. So there was a great interest in building a kind of broader connection between China and Iran's clients in the Arab world, particularly in Iraq, in Syria, and in Lebanon with Hezbollah. A third group of ambassadors from China were diplomats who had wide experience in the region as a whole and who had been previously appointed to special envoys for the Middle East, not for any particular country, but whose portfolios specifically involved assessing and balancing relationships between all of the competing interests in the Middle East, including Turkey and Iran and Israel and various Arab regimes. These ambassadors, of course, had a completely different take on those who were interested in using Iran as a Trojan horse to diminish American and European influence, and those who wanted simply to increase investment, initially in petroleum and then later in infrastructure. These were students of statecraft and diplomacy in the most general sense, who really had a geopolitical strategy and concern, and they were very interested in maximizing whatever leverage they could find in Iran without exploiting it to the point of provocation where it would backfire on them, either with the United States and Europe or with the Gulf Arab countries and with Israel. So this is an effort to answer your question by saying that the Chinese disagree over these questions. They don't have fixed and solid priorities about particular countries. They're very fluid. They argue about it all the time. There are broad outlines, as I said, that the Middle East is not as important as the Pacific or Southeast Asia. Within the Middle East, some countries are more favorable, seen as more as better opportunities or as greater risks than others. But all of this is examined periodically. It's kind of, like looking at the financial markets. You have to pay attention to what sector is up and what sector is down, and you can't just put all of your eggs in one basket or in one firm. And the Chinese are very astute observers of all of these countries. They are also extremely conscious of their ignorance, of their lack of personal involvement and personal experience in the Middle East. They have good language skills, especially in the diplomatic corps. The academics are beginning to develop some language skills as well, but Chinese do not have much freedom of travel, especially the intellectuals, scholars. So if somebody has an opportunity to go abroad for a year and study language or to do research, this is considered, really a great breakthrough for them, great opportunity. And I think that's probably their major disadvantage right now. The political impediments to travel abroad, as well as the cultural and ethnocentric barriers to understanding and appreciating Middle Eastern cultures. So, living in Turkey and teaching in Ortaokul is not something that many Chinese scholars can rely on in their repertoire of experiences in understanding Turkish nationalism or Turkish concerns or Turkish household or father-son relations and so on. And all of these, of course, are extremely important in understanding any culture and political dynamic. So the Chinese are very well that they're in over their heads. And they look around and they see what European colonialists got themselves into and what the Americans got themselves into, and they say, oh my God, we don't want to go down that path. On the other hand, we have a lot of ambitious generals and party leaders who are eager to feed nationalist ambition and show that China is respected and highly regarded around the world. But all of this comes in the context of the reality that the Chinese military is very modest in its ability to project power beyond its borders. And certainly it is effective now in ways that it never was in the Pacific, in dealing with South Asia and Central Asia. The idea of projecting military force into the Middle East is really beyond their capabilities and imagination. Yes, fighting piracy off the coast of Somalia and rescuing Chinese nationals from Libya and from Yemen, but this is a far cry from patrolling the Persian Gulf and taking up some kind of regular naval patrol in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean.
Professor, I really don't want to interrupt you. It's going very well, but there are many questions, and we're running short of time. I'd like you to answer rather briefly to this question. By the way, the previous question was from Mohammed Mehdi Shirazi from Iran. This one that's coming up is from Turkey, from Recep Güller. The question is this: during the Trump administration, Middle Eastern states were free to violate human rights and other sensitive issues. But now that we have a different administration, Biden administration, do you think this new foreign policy of Biden, this new more humanitarian interventionist policy, would, push Arab leaders more towards Chinese side?
Not much. The United States needs to stop human rights violations in its own society, within its own borders first. Then it can look to other countries. Don't overestimate the idealism of American politicians, even if they're Democrats. And Joe Biden is a very pragmatic politician. He has a lot of experience in foreign policy. He's a realist through and through.
As I said, we're running short of time. I'd like to also ask a question, if this won't be a misuse of my position. I really like the idea, which is explored also in your book, in the most recent one by Oxford University, that this new Silk Road initiative is also likely to transform Chinese political class and their attitudes, as well as it is influencing the countries alongside this road. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this, please?
Yes, that's probably the most interesting conclusion of my study, of my research in this area. There are a lot of people who understand the Belt and Road Initiative and the Silk Road strategy in terms of foreign policy, but they don't really think of it as something that will affect China. And this is very important. The Chinese are very attentive to how their government treats foreigners. And they're very sensitive to any inequality in treatment of foreigners and Chinese. The worst thing a Chinese government can do is treat foreigners better than its own citizens. And if the Chinese government is giving concessions to foreign governments who are responding to pressures of their own populations in areas such as economic benefits, labor rights and disputes, environmental protection, censorship, and access to the internet. The Chinese will pick up on this very quickly, and they will say, why are Iranians or Egyptians or Tunisians or Nigerians or Kenyans winning concessions from Chinese companies and state enterprises and diplomats, Chinese embassies? Why are they winning concessions on issues where Chinese demands are being ignored and squashed? Why are Chinese going to jail and disappearing for expressing the same kinds of demands and aspirations that are being granted in countries around the world? Why are Chinese not worthy of the same rights and the same kind of dignity that the Chinese government accords people elsewhere? And of course, this goes back to the memories of imperialism, the century of humiliation, the concessions, the capitulations within China. China is almost like the Ottoman Empire in terms of its experience with capitulations, except that it included military occupation. The Japanese, the Germans, the French, the Americans, the British, the Russians, and so on. And that memory is very, very strong, very strong.
One very last question. It's sort of a collective question, really. It's been asked too much. So I'd like you to address this, please, but in a short way, please. The question goes like this. What would be the possible outcomes or consequences, ramifications for small and middle power states if there will be a shift from the US hegemony to China in the near future? What will be the implications for those states?
I don't think there will be a shift to Chinese hegemony. I think that the Chinese and the Americans are going to figure out eventually that the world doesn't live or die for their power struggles, and that the world is going to go about its own business and pursue its own ambitions, no matter what the Chinese and the Americans do to one another. So how can I put this? China and the United States are very myopic. They think they're the center of the world, and they're not. And people in Turkey know that. And people in Indonesia know that, and in Nigeria, and in Brazil, and lots of other places as well. So I don't think that the world is holding its breath to see who crosses the finish line first. You know, the Chinese 5G or the American 5G or whatever. I think that as your institute demonstrates eloquently, people are thinking for themselves. They are assessing the world and the concepts of politics and international relations and the lessons of history from fresh perspectives. And the Chinese and American scholars and politicians are certainly welcome to join in that discussion, but they don't monopolize it.
No, thank you very much for your time, Professor Bianchi. We're really pleased to have you. It was a really very helpful and an insightful presentation. I'd like to thank you and give the last word to you if there is anything you'd like to say.
No, thank you. I look forward to seeing the final product of your conference. If the summaries and abstracts are any indication, it will be a very rich collection, and I look forward to enjoying the whole assembly, the whole assortment.
For Tom, thank you very much.
Best of luck in your progress.
Thank you very much. So this brings our presentation to an end. Before we go, I'd like to thank my colleagues here at the Institute and here also in the studio. Our Congress will kick off tomorrow in the morning. There are 27 panels and 90 presentations, and I'm sure you will find certain topics very interesting for yourself. We're very much hoping to see you around tomorrow, the day after, and the day after. Thank you for your time. Have a good evening.